Hey there, ceramic students. Welcome back to the ceramic studio. I've got probably one more day left on this kind of high. It's becoming high relief now at this point. Sculpture of just sort of working back into my cube. Chosen sort of a fairly simplistic, sort of overlapping, interweaving band design. There's 3 or 4 bands that sort of wind around the outside of my cube. Some of you guys have chosen really excellent, kind of complicated, complex, difficult carvings. So if you find yourself being really pinched for time, feel comfortable sort of, yeah, I want you to cover all 6 sides, but maybe taper off your design so that maybe 1 or 2 sides have a very dense design, and then it sort of tapers off to the other sides. And also consider what areas of the cube you may be able to remove. Now, I'm on day 3 working on this one, which means my clay has started to dry up, and I'm even occasionally having to use a bit of water to sort of spritz it and keep it workable, but I really like it at this stage. It's like the best carving stage. It's just a tiny bit past leather hard, and so the clay comes off in nice curls. I don't have to worry about collapsing the piece while I'm carving on it. An X-Acto blade does a really great job of sort of getting in to work on just sort of real tiny areas. And we're still following that basic sculptural mantra of work big to small. Big stuff in the last video is like removing corners and actually lowering and raising surfaces. Today, it's not going to look like a whole lot gets done from a distance, right? The piece probably isn't going to look a whole lot different between day 2 and day 3, but you're going back in to do a lot more detail work. It's in the surfaces, it's refining edges, it's, say if you use straight lines like I did, it's coming back in and straightening those lines that kept mushing over yesterday in the wet clay. And so I'll demonstrate just a few things here. I also want to talk just a little bit about possibly working the surfaces. Right? The tendency, I think, is for some of these really geometric designs is to think of them as having to be perfect. Now, clay can be perfect, but it's a little difficult. It's tricky to to maintain those really sharp, clean edges. And you might consider that you don't even really want that, right? So we'll talk a little bit about what you can do to the surfaces to sort of give them a texture, a small surface pattern, even rough them up a little bit to kind of give them a bit of character. And the sort of added benefit is that it hides some of the maybe imperfections of the sculpting along the way. So a couple things that I want to show you that I was doing. I'll find a spot on this cube where I can do a little bit more work. I have to do a little bit of sculpting in this section here and sort of lower it down. You can see that yesterday I made my notches to sort of make it really obvious that this bar here is sort of passing under the other. But I need to sort of remove a bit more clay, so maybe soften this transition. So just running the X-Acto blade sideways over the side of the clay sort of lifts these nice little curlicues of clay off the surface. That's a really nice way of sort of doing a very slow carving. I could also turn my piece to the side here and sort of slice through, or maybe even mark off the side. For that, the X-Acto knife works okay. You may even be able to get your fettling knife to do sort of a little bit longer cuts. But if you happen to be working from home and you have something like this, these are sort of a construction tool. They're a snap knife, so the razor blades are all stored on the inside and you kind of crack it off as you go. I really like these because as I extend the blade, I have a lot of cutting surface. It's for that reason that this is you got to be pretty careful. It's a bit of a dangerous carving approach because there's so much razor blade exposed here. But for doing long straight cuts, or even maybe you could think of them as like shaves, this kind of knife works really, really well. I can remove a lot of clay in a hurry with this knife. So if I have to lower a whole section, or just kind of like reduce the height of it, I really like this tool for doing maybe hogging off like a large flake, and then coming back in and leveling a piece. Where the X-Acto blade gives me a lot of tight control over what's happening, this is able to sort of flatten a large area. If you don't have it, don't worry about it. I also really like the sort of side of my wooden scraper tools. They behave a little bit like a polishing tool to come back in and sort of scrape and lower whole areas. If you want a little bit of help shaping your wooden tools, don't be afraid to reach out and ask me in the studio. We can rough them in on the belt sander, and then you can fine-tune them with your hand sandpaper. So reducing whole areas. I also may come in with say a straight edge and kind of like tune an edge that may have been kind of warbled over after all the kind of handling and monkeying. So I'm going to reestablish a straight edge and not cut off very much of this path, but just shave off just a little bit of this line. Now that the clay is stiffer, it's going to hold that edge a bit better. So I mark it with the X-Acto blade, then maybe come back in and carefully trace that line down. That's just kind of like truing up some of these bands that got a little bit goofed up. And then, working on all these teeny tiny little inside cracks and possibly getting in there with maybe the back end of a paintbrush to sort of smooth out anything that looks a little funky on the inside, anything that I can't reach. I can kind of reach down into the piece from opposite sides. This is one of the other added benefits of opening up some of the holes in your piece, is you can kind of tweak some of the pieces on the inside. So sometimes I'm cutting clay off, sometimes I'm just kind of polishing it down in. But today is really a day of small work. I'm not going to spend too much time in the tutorial working. I'm going to mostly just kind of give you a couple of ideas for the surfacing of your pieces today, and then I'm excited just to sort of see where you take these. Most of you are at a point in your pieces where you're pretty independent. You kind of know what you're doing. If you're following along with my design, you may find this last little bit helpful, but most of you, which is great, most of you are just kind of going it off in your own directions. So I probably have a little bit more fine-tuning work to do here, and gradually my work just gets so small that I don't even really notice the difference, from arm's length away. So it's probably a good sign that the piece is reaching completion. But before the clay completely dries out, I just want to think a little bit about what I might do to the surface of these. I'm thinking maybe of a way to differentiate one sort of band from the other than that they go under each other. I wonder if there's something I could do to the surface of these to sort of describe those a bit better. And so I've got a couple options I'll maybe walk through today, and you can choose which ones you like. Some of them you may have the right tool for, other ones you may just kind of have to modify something or work with it, or work with a tool you have in a different way. But the first one is pretty simple. Instead of trying to sort of shape the clay at all, I'm going to add a thin layer of slip to the outside and use the slip almost like a sculptural addition to the piece. My slip is pretty watery, and so as I lay the slip on, it will pull itself into the clay, and whatever brush strokes the brush leaves behind will sort of stay as textures. Or you could also kind of dab it in a little bit, and the sort of raised quality of that slip will sort of leave behind that texture. I find this to be sort of a really nice way of finishing a piece instead of always trying to make it perfectly smooth. And so this in a few minutes you'll see how this texture sort of stands up on the clay and just kind of bonds and becomes part of the clay itself. And you could go back in and modify it. You could kind of flatten it back with a thumb or something like that, or if you just kind of like the way it looks standing up a little bit, go ahead and keep that way. So maybe one of my bands, I will be using, this sort of light slip texture on the outside to describe the difference one to the other. It's subtle, right? It's still going to be all the same color as all the other clay, but it sort of plays with light a little bit differently. This is a really low relief texturing technique, and I'll put one coat on and see how that looks. Now, another technique I sort of like to use is a dimpling technique that I built the tool for, and you can sort of see it on the back edge of this small ocarina that I was working on last spring. And to sort of pick up a little bit of a dappled texture with the glaze, I designed a tool using a bit of wood and some rounded over copper wire, and it creates sort of a dappling or almost a stone-like texture to the surface. And so I'll just kind of demonstrate how I might work that here. This feels a little bit less natural, I guess you'd say. It has a little bit of the kind of rounded circular qualities, but I really like how it catches stains and glazes, which is a little tricky for you guys to think about if you haven't already done a little bit of staining or glazing. But you can kind of imagine how these subtle dishes in the clay might pick up the color differently down the road. So you can sort of see how these two textures offset each other. So I've got, a smooth, a coarse, a rough, a textured, different ways that I can work with the surface of the clay. And the added bonus here is that, I don't have to be so precise with some of my surfaces. I can let the texture sort of speak for some of that. So if texturing is something you guys are excited about, go for it. I can even help you design a tool if you have something in mind. We can kind of work together in the studio to put something together for you that you could use for this project or even other projects. Eventually, this thing will be too dry to work back into, and you'll have to call it done. At the very end, I may take a wet sponge just to rough off any kind of coarse corners or anything that doesn't quite look like it belongs. Maybe thumb down a wet corner just very lightly. It's nice when the clay has sort of picked up a level of rigidity. You don't have to worry about really deforming the clay with the water and thumbing down an edge. It really just kind of a way to smooth off hard edges and any tool marks that are still showing. So keep everything cleaned up, set that aside, and let it slowly dry. Guys, I look forward to seeing how you approach this stuff in the studio. I'll catch up with you at school.